celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
In our 20 years of broadcasting this program, this may be one of the most serious programs that we've ever done. We're going to come to you for the next 3 weeks on this subject, and we have two guests that are most qualified of anyone in this country to discuss this subject. We're entitling this three-part series, The Crime of the 20th Century in the Pacific Northwest. Many of you have heard in past years about what was called Order 1, which was a group of people who organized in the early 1980s, and there was a spree of crimes not only here in the Northwest but around the country, although the order was located in the Pacific Northwest. The two guests that we have for all three programs, this first to my far left is Larry Broadbent, who in 1981 became the undersheriff of Kootenai County, Idaho, and was the first person in law enforcement to suspect that something was going on that was extremely serious. In 1984, the federal government and the Justice Department reopened the FBI office in Coeur d'Alene and brought to the Northwest Wayne Manis, who is our second guest, who became a FBI special agent. And you will see as this story unfolds on this program how these two gentlemen worked together and also in separate law enforcement units to be able to be here to tell this story and how it came to a conclusion with conviction of 23 people. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. It's a very special privilege to have you here for the next 3 weeks.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm going to start with you, Larry. As I indicated in the opening comments, you did become the undersheriff. You were appointed after the election in 1980 as undersheriff, and I would like for you to tell us where you first got the idea that there was a serious problem that had to be dealt with, and take us through those early years, because it is my understanding that you took on as one of your duties, with the permission of the sheriff, an investigation, and you compiled a rather large dossier on the activities.
Yes. Before we took office, we had a meeting with several concerned citizens up here in North Idaho, and they had a lot of concern about the activities that was going on with local white supremacist group here in North Idaho, and there were some indications that they were moving about in a more militant manner than they had before. Because of that meeting, then Sheriff Stalder and prosecuting attorney Glenn Walker asked me to compile information regarding this group or groups, and to basically find out just what was going on.
And you were talking about in December 1980 when this
December
started.
1980, right. In October 1981, the Aryan Nations held a unification conference with the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and of Canada and the United States. And it was because of that meeting, particularly with the 100-year history connected with Klan activities, the violent history that they have of the Klan, I became very, very concerned about who these people are that were attending the conference, and also those who were meeting and moving into Idaho. By 1983, I'd amassed quite a bit of information regarding some of these individuals and their background, and I found that there was a lot of recruitment of ex-felons right out of the prisons up to this area and into the Aryan Nations. Seen or heard about a lot of stockpiling of weaponry, and there was a lot of malicious harassment more directed at minorities in this area and in the Northwest. There was a lot of anti-government statements, tax protesting, and so on. And also there was a lot of defacing of currency and the basic overall denouncement of our form of government, and then the avocation of its overthrow. The one that also put a lot of emphasis on my information or information gathering was also the territorial imperative, which was the establishment of this area into, or the 5-state, basically parts of 5 states in the Pacific Northwest as their white Aryan homeland in the Northwest. The ensuing conferences became a lot more militant. And
when you're saying the ensuing congresses, now you're talking
right.
about in what, 92, 93, or
82 and 83, right? They became a lot more militant. There was a lot of classes and lectures and instruction in urban guerrilla warfare, using basically from the manual called The Road Back. A lot of the white supremacist leaders that were brought in from around the country were asking and demanding that they, the Aryans, take some action. And of course the young militant members were demanding that to take action now. By the fall of 1983, or shortly after the 83 conference, the Bruderswagen, or the Silent Brotherhood, or we know it better as the Order, was formed then by 9 members from various factions of these extremist groups.
So here you arrive at the end of 83. You've been under sheriff for 3 years, basically, 81, 82, and 83. Your files, and you've shown me some of the things, you had photographs of some of the people that were involved in this order. You had some other documents showing the kind of things that you shared with our viewers. You must have been somewhat overwhelmed, a small sheriff's department, this kind of activity that you have found in your jurisdiction. How did you react as a law enforcement person? At this point, the FBI was not involved and other agencies. I know we'll come back to you in a minute and talk about your work with the special agent of the FBI in the early part. But what was your feelings? What was your concern, saying, how are we going to deal with this?
Well, I knew by the information that I was amassing that this was more than just a local problem, and it was more than just a regional problem to begin with. There were jurisdictional problems outside of our own county, those in our neighboring county of Idaho, and then we had counties and cities in Spokane and eastern Washington, western Montana as well. We had a lot of members up here at that time, probably somewhere between 80 and 100 members belonged to the Aryan Nations at that particular time. And so it was very difficult to monitor or track these individuals when, from the sheriff's office standpoint, that your jurisdiction basically ended at the county lines. Yeah. And
well, that's when something else happened then. We again welcome Wayne Maness to our program. He is with the FBI and became a special agent. Wayne, I know from a meeting that we had preparing for this program that you came in February 1984. Would you share with our viewers, and there's been some misconceptions, many people thought the offices opened up and you were brought here because of the order. Would you tell us why you came and what happened?
Sure, right. It was a pleasure to be here, Tony. No, that wasn't the case. Actually, we had always had FBI had always had a presence here in Coeur d'Alene for many years, and it had just happened that the office had been a small office. We'd had one agent here, and that agent had transferred in November of '83, and the office had been basically unmanned from November of '83 until February of '84, at which time I arrived here. And I didn't come here with the express purpose of investigating this group. I came here to carry on the normal duties of the FBI, as this office in Coeur d'Alene covered half the state of Idaho at that time. But upon arriving here, when I was doing my briefing and gathering my intelligence information and reviewing the case files at our headquarters office, which was located in Butte, Montana at that time, one of the matters which I had taken notice of was the group that was known as the Aryan Nation. And I knew this group vaguely, not in any depth, and was interested in seeing what had happened with this group. And so as I took a look at it, I have to be honest in saying that I came from an office in the South. I had been assigned in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was quite familiar with the Ku Klux Klan and had worked crimes related to these types of groups. So I had in my mind a vision that this group was very similar to the Ku Klux Klan. It didn't take me long as I began to study the information available to realize that there was something more to this group, something a bit more sinister going on than you normally would expect to see with a group, say a Ku Klux Klan organization that had meetings once a week. And so you have to tell you, though, that the FBI is very cautious in approaching investigations of domestic groups. There are some very strict congressional dictates and guidelines that tell us what we can do and what we can't do. And we're very cautious about investigating domestic groups because we recognize and realize that people have certain constitutional rights to have their beliefs and to have their political beliefs and their religious beliefs without being spied upon by the FBI. As long as these beliefs don't step over the boundaries and infringe the civil rights and liberties of other American citizens, as long as they don't violate laws of the Constitution of the United States. And that was the thing that we had to keep in mind here.
But then you discovered from your early investigation that there was this seriousness, and I believe that is when you met Larry Broadbent.
When I got here in February of '84, I had a multitude of investigative matters, not just this one, but fugitives and bankruptcy fraud matters and many other matters that are investigated by the FBI. And one of those matters was to take a look within the guidelines set forth by Congress to see whether or not this group deserved any closer investigation. I went to visit Larry Broadbent shortly after I arrived here in February of '84, and Larry was very helpful to me because he'd done an excellent job of gathering together information on identities of people and information from the congresses that they had held in 1982 and 1983. And I was able to get some good insight from Larry in that regard.
And Larry, it's my understanding that, and talking to both of you, that it was this point that you made a real strong point with Wayne Maness that this really needed to go beyond the Sheriff's Department.
Yes, as I explained, I think we're lacking the jurisdictional problem outside of our area. I really perceive that this would require more than just a state agency or local agencies cooperating. There was no doubt in my mind that by the end of 1983 that we were in had serious problems in North Idaho.
We got so much to do in this first show, and we're already halfway through, but this was really a critical point. Wayne, I know that it was there's important decisions here that resulted in this full investigation. So one of them was you're going to Larry Broadbent. Larry Broadbent emphasizing so strongly to you the seriousness of this, and then you made a really important decision. Isn't it true that you have to do a report to the National FBI Office to justify what would meet the criteria for a full investigation? So you made a decision at this point to write that report, did you not?
Well, I did a great deal of investigation. When I left Larry, my work was laid out for me, and within the guidelines, I began to conduct investigation that was permitted under those circumstances and gathered the information available. And yes, It was a report that had to be prepared if any additional investigation was going to be conducted. Decisions are made not by me, but by the FBI headquarters and the Justice Department to determine whether these guidelines have been satisfied. In July, I submitted the first report in this matter, July of 1984. It was a lengthy report, and fortunately when it was reviewed, the report came back with an authorization to conduct, rather than a preliminary investigation, a full-scale domestic terrorism investigation into this group.
Once you got that permission, and again, I want to give you a lot of credit because you had to make a call on your own about you had the proper information to ask for this full investigation. You got it, and then through '84, the rest of that year, there was a real change in what happened as the full investigation got underway. Could you take our viewers through a few examples of the number of FBI people that were involved, and there were some special units that gave you the chance to really find out tremendous amount of information that Larry had started with his early investigation?
Yes, well, after the report was written and we received our authorization to conduct a full-scale investigation, my office in Butte, Montana, which was commanded by Bill Fallon, the SAC, and Toby Harding, the Assistant Special Agent in charge, they threw their support behind me in this regard, and they realized I was out there by myself. And Joe Venkes, who was manning the office in Lewiston, closed that office and came to Coeur d'Alene to give me a hand, and some plans were being made to augment our workforce here. It wasn't long until they had sent 3 or 4 other agents in from the surrounding area, and together we were operating as a team to gather everything we could on the movement in and out of the area of personalities and people at the Aryan Nation compound, which is located in Hayden, and in the surrounding areas of Idaho.
Then as it moved on, there was a time, am I correct, that you had 40 or 50 agents at a time on the case?
Oh yeah, Tony, it was the kind of thing where there weren't any set hours. The work days were as long as you could stand it. From 15, 18 hours, 24-hour days. We worked day and night. We worked weekends.
Time away from the family. You just
left and went where you had to go and stayed with it. And the Bureau was real good. They sent help as they could. I remember when I was calling for some help, and I had 7 guys, and then 15 people arrived from San Francisco FBI.
And you had a special group from Washington, D.C., the terrorist...
The hostage rescue team sent 20, I think it was 23 people came in from there.
What I want to do now, again, rushing through the first program, but as you got into a full investigation and found out people who were involved and the kinds of suspicions you had of crimes, you even found that the order was so structured that it had a medallion, for example, that each member got, that there's this kind of brotherhood we're talking about. I want them to put on the screen the medallion. A lot of people haven't seen that, and let you describe what this looks like.
Right. Tony, this is a Bruderschweigen medallion. This was designed by the members of the order, and it was constructed of silver and gold, and it symbolized the belief in a pure Aryan state. The medallion was given to each of the members of the order once they were accepted as warriors in the order. Mm-hmm. There were 23 of these, I know, that were issued to members of the order.
We know that there were 20, from your investigation and the arrest and the court trial, that there were 23 subjects involved at least.
Right, 23 members of the order, and I don't know how many of these medallions may have actually been issued, but I'm certain of that.
Larry, from your files and from the FBI files, you both have had photographs and documents, and we won't get into specific crimes on show 2, but at this time we're going to ask our staff to put up on the screen some photographs or some slides, I think, before we move into the specific crimes that our viewers would like to have you to identify some of the people who were members of Order 1 and who were later arrested and the convictions took place. So if our staff could give us those photographs or slides, I will ask you to take. Now, some of these are ones that you had gathered over those early years, the 80s, or even into the 80s later. And I know that Wayne has some too, but we've just taken those from you. So if we could have those slides, please, we would ask you to show us and tell us. Here we go.
This slide is Gary Yarborough on the guard tower overlooking the Aryan Nations compound. These are 4 individuals of one of the congresses. That was David Tate. It's Gary Lee Yarborough again with his daughter. Yarborough again giving instructions at the compound. That's Randy Dew, I believe. These are 6 members of the order. This is Bruce Pierce,
Who was one of the leaders.
one of the leaders, and some more order members.
So we've taken through just a part of identifying of some of those. And of course, later it was known that Robert Matthews was the leader of the order as they became more structured and developed. Larry, I think we also will have you to take us through some other headlines that we're going to have here, and also some, I believe you have some photographs in all of the ranges where they were doing target practicing. Maybe as those are coming up, you can give us a little bit of a story about some of the military type or paramilitary operations that were underway.
Okay.
If you just go ahead and describe some of those.
We had some of the...
Here we go with some of the shots.
Of course, that's the Aryan Nations compound. This was a range we discovered near National Forest where they used targets.
And here we have the indictment of 23 order members after the arrest took place.
And they also, the order purchased a training camp up here. And the Ukiah robbery was the largest crime that they committed as far as money went. They followed a revolutionary book entitled Turner Diaries that they used as their blueprint for the order.
And there's another shot of Yarborough. And this is a picture of the United States across the United States. Some of the crimes that took place across the country, isn't it?
Right.
So both the FBI and your office now knew that the crimes were not confined to the Pacific Northwest.
That's right, and they brought in other people from way outside of our area too. And as I said, that's what made it so very difficult for a local agency to investigate that. That's for sure, for certain, is why we needed the federal jurisdiction.
Wayne, I want to come back to you in the time we have left, and I'm continue to remind our viewers to come back next week when we'll get into real specifics of how you followed the chronology of crimes that took place. But would you take some time now to tell us this, after you got way up into 1984 and you have a real full investigation, or maybe even into 85, as you're getting ready to take more action that will lead to arrest, would you kind of describe the structure of the order? And I understand that there were sub-areas or groups that were given certain assignments. Just kind of give us an overall view of what you finally learned about the structure.
Sure. The order was headed by one individual, Robert J. Matthews, commonly known as Bob Matthews. He was the indisputed leader of the group. Matthews had formed cells. He had various cells that were responsible for certain things. One group of individuals would have a responsibility of continually counterfeiting identification and data and gathering new identification, phony driver's license.
So that was delegated to specific people?
Specific people. That's all. That was all they were doing. Other people were gathering safe houses. Some people were setting up telephone message centers across the United States. There were other groups that were assigned with robberies and assassinations. Certain people were gathering weapons. They had weapons people that they hired just for weapons experts. People were out in other capacities gathering up land for training camps. So they were gathering weapons and explosives and establishing safe houses and getting telephone message centers and establishing multiple identifications. They even had a survival warehouse that they set up that was full of military surplus. A very well organized group. Probably, without a doubt, the best organized, the most serious terrorist threat that this country has ever seen.
You know, I think I probably understated in my opening statement when I said this was the crime of the 20th century in the Pacific Northwest, but I hear you saying that this was the most organized conspiracy in the history of the country?
A terrorist group, yes. This country's been fortunate it hasn't had to experience the types of terrorism that other countries have. This group had some very serious plans. They were very dedicated and committed to their cause. It's frightening to think of what might have happened had they not been stopped when they were.
And again, we're trying to tell this history that some of this came out, of course, during the trials, but you're going into more depth on this. One of the reasons we're doing this series is there's things coming to the forefront here that the general public has never heard in this kind of detail. Wayne, am I hearing you correctly to say that it is a wrong impression to think that the order only operated here, for example, North Idaho, that when you talk about these cells and these organizations, those were located at different places with different activities?
Well, they were highly mobile, Tony. They didn't stay in one place long. We tracked them across the country from Idaho over into Washington, into Oregon, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Georgia, Alabama.
So that map that we showed of the United States was very realistic about the across the country.
We had our work cut out for us. They were prepared, organized, and had their mandate, and we were playing catch-up.
Let's follow this point for a minute, because you told me that the other day, that by the time that Larry had gathered his information, you had come here and you made the decision to ask the FBI in full investigation. They were really underway operating, and so you were trying to catch up.
Absolutely. 1983 was a growing year for them. It was a developing year for them. Larry had gathered intelligence on personalities, but Larry didn't know what crimes were being committed. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what crimes were being committed. When we came into this thing and had our conversation in early '84, we knew who personalities were, but we were behind the ball as far as knowing what was going on.
They were still recruiting and expanding.
You had already committed some crimes.
Yes. You told me that once your investigation became a full investigation, they were aware that you were on their track, that then they moved into a more defensive mode of, and in other words, even your early investigation slowed down the recruitment and expansion. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know. I really feel like that we kept a very covert status through the early part of '84, and I don't think it was, I think it's fair to say that it probably wasn't until the late summer, early fall of '84 that they became fully aware that this barking dog had teeth.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion. Wayne Manis, Larry Broadbent, I thank you, and I want to tell our viewers we're going to be with you for 2 more weeks, and on next week's program, it'll be very specific. It will talk about the chronology of crimes. The FBI has here with us a list and dates and places where those crimes took place. We'll also show you some documents from the order and what they did. I know you found this program most interesting and very serious, and we invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, and we shall continue this series. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. Celebrating our 20th season. From the College by the Lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
On program number 2 this week, we're going to deal with the topic, the crime of the 20th century in the Pacific Northwest. For you viewers who were with us last week, we talked about an organization called Order 1, and we brought you through the formation and what happened and the role of law enforcement in looking into that organization and the crime that was taking place throughout not only the Northwest but the United States. I told you then, and for you who are new with us today, that we would look at specific crimes that the order was charged with and convicted in a major trial that took place in Seattle, Washington. I want to welcome back the 2 law enforcement persons that one can describe as the most responsible for opening up this investigation led to the arrest of 23 people in the order. First of all, Larry Broadbent, who was the undersheriff of Kootenai County during that period. Welcome back to program number 2. We look forward to having you here today and again next week. And I'm also happy to welcome back Wayne Manis, who was the special agent with the FBI that opened up this investigation that led to a successful conclusion of arrest and convictions. Wayne, again, pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Tony.
On program number 2, it is our purpose, as I said, to get into some of the specific crimes that took place. And for viewers who weren't with us, Wayne, you and Larry did an excellent job last week of taking us through how you set up your investigation, and it became a full-blown investigation, and you had tracked the order around the country. I would like for you to pick up now for us and give us some real specifics of the crimes that you saw at the very beginning and how those led to arrest.
Well, Tony, in 1984, when I first arrived here in February of 1984, it became obvious that there was a strong organization of individuals here who were acting in a very sinister manner, but we didn't know what crimes, if any, had specifically been committed at that time. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that there were a number of very significant crimes that we could attribute to this group, and fortunately we were able to gather some evidence as time went along. The leader of the group, Bob Matthews, had tried to take his membership along a path of establishing a financial basis for them. He had to finance this group somehow or another. And one of the first attempts at doing this was they began to counterfeit money. This took place at the Aryan Nations compound in Hayden, Idaho. And the money was counterfeited by various members of that group. Bob Matthews was there, and David Lane was there, and Gary Yarbrough was there, David Tate, and others. And this was perhaps the first act that we could positively identify that would subsequently appear in our case as a criminal act by the group, perhaps the first act that we could identify. Bob Matthews, being the leader of the group, he took one of the early actions in leading a group into the robbery of a porno theater. He himself committed one of the first armed robberies in that he robbed a bank in Seattle. That was in December of '83, and shortly after that, that action was followed by another bank robbery.
Was that '83 or '84?
That was in December of '83, and then in January of '84, the next month, Gary Yarbrough and Bruce Pierce robbed a bank in Spokane. So the order was building, and the means of, they were becoming bolder and bolder in their efforts to finance this organization.
And so they were financing it through both counterfeiting and robbing banks, or armed
robberies and armed robberies. At that time, it was banks, but it wasn't long until it was a classic case of progressive criminal action, because you saw them do these smaller armed robberies where there really wasn't any significant amounts of money coming in. Until they committed an armored car robbery in Seattle in March of '84, and things were working well. And then comes the month of April of '84, and here they are with a bombing, another armored car robbery, which nets $500,000, the first significant money that they really had their hands on, followed by another bombing in the month of April, as things progress along from April, we find that in June there were 2 assassinations, 2 murders that were attributed to them. One, a member of the Aryan Nation group, Walter West, who had coincidentally witnessed the counterfeiting and was removed from their presence, so he wouldn't have an opportunity to talk about it. And then, of course, the murder of Alan Berg on June the 18th, I believe it was, in 1984, followed by the very next month in July with a $3.6 million armored car robbery in Ukiah, California. The group was on a roll here, and they were very dedicated, very committed in their in their activities, as were we, the members of the FBI, who at that time had assembled and in large numbers, and we were actively tracking and tracing this group across the country and building evidence in an effort to get our warrant so that we could arrest them and bring this criminal spree to an end.
By this point, with your investigation, what you've gone, a chronology you've taken us partially through, when you're talking about counterfeiting money, major robberies with millions of dollars involved, murder now involved, you knew that you had an extremely serious criminal investigation underway, and that as this continued, there were victims, and at this point too, with that kind of resources, it would, from the robberies and so forth, they would have money to expand and do other things, would they not?
They would, and they did. They bought sophisticated weaponry. They rented and obtained safe houses, and they gathered explosives. They set up telephone contact locations in order to keep track of each other, in order to receive their messages in a covert fashion. And they gathered about getting multiple identifications, so that when one individual was identified under one identification, he immediately had another identification to pick up and travel under. They used their money to buy paramilitary training facilities, property, and they got, in one particular instance, they obtained a survival warehouse which contained surplus military-type items. They were very well organized.
To stop at this point, when you talk about they were involved with some paramilitary training at this point, again, from what you have indicated in the evidence presented in court, this was military training for the idea to overthrow the government.
That was their stated purpose, that they would bring enough terrorist act and pressure upon the United States government that they would force a territorial imperative, as they called it, a mandate on the United States government to break off 5 northwestern states and place them under their command, their control. States that would be Aryan homeland for them.
And those have been identified for the viewers who might be new to this whole story. Those were Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana.
That's correct.
At this point, I would suspect, and I never had the experience of investigation like you, but what you have brought to my mind is that now that you know the magnitude of the crimes and the seriousness, as you prepare for the proper search warrants and other evidence you need, aren't you moving rather cautiously, though? You want to make sure that you are able to identify all those who are involved. I mean, as widespread as it's become, wasn't it difficult to know exactly the whole network within the order?
It was, and we had to keep in mind that that it's one thing to suspect or to feel that you know something, but evidence is quite another. And our job was to gather the evidence, and that's what we were trying to do. Now, we took a covert status ourselves. That is, we did a lot of surveillance, a lot of intelligence gathering, without coming out and making our presence obvious to those people. And that lasted pretty much from the time that I'd say March of '84 up until the early fall of '84. When, after the robbery in July and the assassination of Alan Berg in June, we were looking for evidence to link these crimes, and we needed a break. And we really got our first good break in June, when Tom Martinez was caught in Pennsylvania attempting to pass counterfeit money that had been given to him by members of the order. And the second break at the armored car robbery in Ukiah, when Robert Matthews dropped his handgun inside the armored car van, and that led us, that gun traced to an alias for Andy Barnhill, who we found living under an alias, Keith Merwin, I believe it was, at Laclede, Idaho. Those two items there, plus some really great work by our agents Tucker and Tenbensel out in San Francisco, who found the location where the order had hid before the robbery, and were able to take some good investigative action and locate some payphones where they made calls. Some of those calls led us back to Idaho and to Montana, to Gary Yarbrough and Bruce Carroll Pierce.
Now you had evidence.
Now we had evidence.
That you've identified, and you know all these different crimes that you just mentioned led right back to the leaders of the order. From talking to you, I know then that there was, and if I've left something critical out, let me know, but then there was 3 different incidents that really was bringing this to a conclusion. One, if I'm correct, was in Sandpoint, Idaho. I'd like to tell that story. And one was in Portland at a motel in Portland, Oregon, and the third one was on Whidbey Island. If you would take us through those.
Sure. When Bob Tucker and Bill Tinbensel sent me the information on 2 phone numbers, one in Troy, Montana, and one in Sandpoint, Idaho, we traced those down and began a surveillance on those particular locations. Well, the one in Sandpoint, Idaho was a phone number to a fellow by the name of Gary Yarbrough. Actually, the name of that he was using was Jerry Oldbu. And I didn't know Jerry Oldbu, but I'd seen photos of Gary Yarbrough. And I took a surveillance position, watched Gary Yarbrough, or watched this house, and when Jerry Oldbu came out, I said, well, that's Gary Yarbrough. I recognized him. We tracked him for several days. He led us to a storage facility, which we ultimately obtained a surreptitious search warrant and determined there was ammunition stored there in. Ultimately, Gary Yarbrough moved from the location where we were watching him to a remote wooded location where we couldn't watch him anymore. And this disturbed me after several days of not being able to see him, because we were in a covert status ourselves, so you couldn't go up and knock on the door and see where he's at. And so that concerned me, and about that time I got subpoenaed on a murder trial to Pennsylvania myself, and upon leaving I asked one of our other agents, Mike Johnston, to take a Forest Service truck and 3 agents and some Forest Service uniforms and work their way through the forest and try to identify what cars were there and if Gary Yarbrough was there and what was going on. They did this, and I told them when I left with it, we wanted to stay in a covert status. Well, keeping that in mind, when Mike Johnston took the group through, Gary Yarbrough was there. Gary Yarbrough acted in a very foolish and violent fashion. He came out with a 45 semi-automatic and he opened fire on the agents. And that led us to use that action to obtain a search warrant, enter Gary Yarbrough's residence in an effort to serve the search warrant and to arrest him. We did that, and in the ensuing search, Yarbrough escaped through the woods, but we found in there some extremely valuable evidence, documents and coded documents and identification of order members, as well as some extensive number of weapons, one of which happened to be the weapon that was used to murder Allenberg.
So he'd kept the weapon, and you were able to show that that was the weapon that killed Allenberg. But also, didn't you find a hit list of people that were on a hit list?
We did.
So this was really a major breakthrough for you. I know we're having such a frustration with the time that we have here to go through all this, but then after that kind of evidence, then you were led to Portland, Oregon, and tell us who was at the motel and who you were able to arrest.
Because of as I told you, we had a significant event that developed with the arrest of Tom Martinez.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Martinez agreed to help us. He subsequently led us to Portland, Oregon, where we found Bob Matthews and Gary Yarbrough to be hiding out there at that location. In moving in on that situation, there was a shooting, and Gary Yarbrough was arrested. Bob Matthews shot one agent and was shot himself and escaped. And we ultimately tracked Bob to Whidbey Island, where he was living in a safe house, and we found 2 other houses there that were occupied by order members also.
And you were able to arrest all the order members that were there with the exception of Bob Matthews?
That's correct. All the order members surrendered, Randy Dewey attempted to escape, and as he left his house, he was running with a weapon in each hand and ran into a fortified SWAT team and surrendered at that point. The Murkeys surrendered from another house. However, Bob Matthews refused to surrender. Ultimately, he died in the house, which caught fire on the night of the second day of the siege there.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you really were hoping that there could be an arrest, because I've heard you say that you believe a lot of documents and other things were lost.
Oh yeah, the last thing I wanted to see was a fire in that house, because in that house contained, me as the case agent, the evidence I probably needed to help facilitate the conviction of these people for their crimes that they'd committed.
I'm going to ask our staff to put up on the screen at this time what we call a chronology of crimes. And when you have been dealing with some of these examples, then I'm going to ask you to take us through, as they come across the screen, each crime. I would like the viewers to see the large number of incidents that we're talking about, if you would do that.
Sure. The counterfeit money that was printed at the compound in September of '83 that I mentioned to you, followed by Bob Matthews' robbery of a bank in Seattle in December of '83. The very next month, it was Pearson Yarbrough that robbed a bank in Spokane. And then in March, we had the first armored car robbery, which netted him only $40,000. Followed in April by a robbery of a bombing of a porno theater, a robbery of an armored car, which brought in $500,000, and then another bombing of a Jewish synagogue in Boise. The very next month, Walter West was murdered by members of the Order in North Idaho, and on June the 18th, Alan Berg was assassinated over in Denver. In July, they hit their big score of $3.6 million on the armored car robbery. Then in October, we had the shootout with Yarbrough that I just mentioned. In November of '84, we were in Portland and had the shootout with Matthews and captured Yarbrough. And then in December, we tracked Matthews to Whidbey Island, where we had the shootout with him. David Tate killed a trooper in Missouri. And then in April, there was the indictment that we received of 23 members on 21 counts. In May of '85, this situation occurred with Eldon Bud Cutler, which I'll tell you more about later. And Cutler was subsequently arrested. And in September to December, we had the trial members of the Order where all were either convicted or pled guilty. That is the end of Order 1, and that at that point, that was the termination of that phase of the investigation.
We have on the screen now Order 2, and what happened
That
there?
was David Dorr and his group, which commenced in '86. They did bombing of Classic Auto and Solomon's.
If we can ask them to stop the screen right here if they can, so we can have a little more talking about that. Those two bombings took place out in Hayden.
Right.
And then following that, there was some other bombings that really caused national attention that you see here, I believe, and started in September, I guess, in Coeur d'Alene.
Right. On September the 15th is when Father Bill Wasmuth's residence was severely bombed, and that was an action that was taken by David Dorr and Ed Hawley and members of their group.
And yeah, and Bill Wasmuth was a priest who was president of the Cooney County Task Force, and he was targeted as the leader of the civil rights. Then 2 weeks later, I believe it was September 29th, we had other bombings. We did. We had bombings at the parking lot of the restaurant here in Coeur d'Alene, and the Gibbs Mercantile building, and the federal building, which housed the FBI office. That was a deliberate attempt to strike out at the FBI, who had done the extensive investigation of Order 1. There were attempted bombings at the Armed Forces recruiting station located across the street from the federal building. And there was a plan, a conspiracy to rob the National Guard Armory, a bank in Coeur d'Alene, and a bank in Rathdrum, which never materialized. Mm-hmm. So those bombings brought, again, lots of attention and a lot of investigation. And there were other arrests, and then there were, I believe, they plea bargained in that case.
In October of '88, yes, right. It was a very extensive investigation and then a plea bargaining.
Mm-hmm. We went through real rapidly because of lack of time, but you can see what went across the screen there. Our viewers can. In summary, we're talking about, again, robberies, armored robberies, murder, counterfeiting, bombings, all kinds of things that took place from this investigation we've been talking about.
We attributed over 60 crimes to this group.
That's really, and very serious crimes.
Very serious crimes, yes.
As we were going through the screen rather rapidly, and you had to identify those fast, one of those that has been a lot of attention was, I believe Cutler was the security chief at the compound. And would you tell us a little more detail what happened there?
Yes, as the trial on Order 1 was about to commence in '85, Bud Cutler found himself in a position of wanting to do something to help, and he knew the chief principal witness was Tom Martinez. So he decided that the best thing he could do would be to have Tom Martinez murdered, and thereafter to have his head severed from his body. He wanted the head sent to either an FBI office or to Crim 2 News. And fortunately for us, when he contacted somebody to initiate to have this done, he contacted an FBI informant that was working for us. We gathered the information specifically through wiring the informant to make sure that we understood what Cutler wanted done. And at that point, we began to bring in an undercover agent as an assassin who took money from Bud Cutler to assassinate Tom Martinez. Of course, the whole idea in this was to gather the evidence to show that Cutler was trying to have Martinez murdered. And we presented very graphic physical photographs to convince Cutler that the murder had been completed. And upon viewing those photographs, Cutler was satisfied that the murder had been completed as ordered. He paid the money, and I was in the next room watching the whole deal on a television. At that point, we came inside, arrested Cutler, had a very successful trial. Ron Hohen handled the prosecution of that matter, and Cutler was convicted and sent to prison.
Ron Hohen's been very successful in the prosecutions of these crimes.
He's an excellent prosecutor.
Yeah.
He's been very heavily involved in a lot of this that we've talked about.
Isn't it also correct that when the thousands of dollars were brought forth for paying for the assassination, that in addition to Martinez, that there were 3 other people that he had proposed to have eliminated?
There were other individuals that he had indicated that he would like to have taken care of at a later time.
Larry, we've spent a lot of time with Wayne Manson on the show, but I know that recently you showed me 3 documents that were from Order 1, and one is called The Principles of War and Rules of Engagement by the Order. I think that this is very significant to show what they were saying. The second one was the open letter to the United States Congress, and the third was the declaration of war by the Order on November the 25th, 1984. I think we'll have those on the screen, and I shall read what they are and then try to get, if we have time, a comment from you. These documents really indicated that they were very, very serious and very directed at, it says principles of Order Number 1 says, we have no desire to harm anyone who has not desired to harm us. In keeping with political thinking, this is purely a struggle for power. It went on to say that we enjoin all people to choose intelligently which side they will be on. Make sure that you have the greatest number of relevant facts possible. There will surely come a day when fence setting will be impossible, and once you have made up your mind and begin to act, the die is cast for you. There will be no turning back. With these things said, let the battle begin. The second document was called an open letter to the United States Congress, and it had that same very, very threatening words that were put forth in the document when it said that we now close the declaration with an open letter to Congress and our signatures confirming our intent to do battle. Let friend and foe alike be made aware. This is war. And the final document was called, as I indicated, the Declaration of War on November the 25th, 1984. And this document ends with, no, when the day comes, we will not ask whether you swung to the right or whether you swung to the left. We will simply swing you by the neck. Larry, would you like to make a comment on how these documents became part of demonstrating the seriousness of this problem.
And certainly, those letters were sent out. I'm not sure about the distribution, but I'd say widespread throughout a lot of the extremist organizations throughout the United States. That they're selected, the groups that they had selected, organizations that they had selected to become part of that feeling of what their intent was. I believe that each one of those documents itself specifically gives the intent of the nature of their group. They say in the first document that you can't sit on the fence, that you either have to join them or you're against them. You did have no options. That was the two options. You were either with them or you're against them. The declaration or the open letter to Congress was their attempt to let the federal government or the government know of their intent to carry out that power or struggle or revolution, and it was to begin, and again it was to be cited. You were either for or against them, and then with the declaration of war, which in the declaration of war basically outlined that we are in a war, Armageddon in some respects, but not for the fight for good and evil, but for one side.
We have to bring our program conclusion on that very sober note, but it sure was there and clear what the intent was. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we will do part 3 and our final part on the issue of the Order 1, or what has been described as the most serious crime spree in the Pacific Northwest in the 20th century. And we'll do our summary at that time and what happened in the trials and the convictions. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. Celebrating our 20th season. From the College by the Lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to part 3 in our 3-part series entitled The Crime of the 20th Century in the Pacific Northwest. I'm sure many of you have watched programs 1 and 2, but for you who have not, we have been discussing the crime of Order 1. Near the end of program 2, we also identified Order 2 and the crimes that that organization committed. We have 2 law enforcement guests that are instrumental and actually the 2 leaders in dealing with the investigation and successful conclusion of that investigation of that crime spree that was not only in the Northwest but throughout the country. I welcome back to the program, first of all, Larry Broadbent, who was, starting in 1981 for 8 years, the undersheriff of Kootenai County and was instrumental in opening up investigation that led to contacts with the FBI on the issue of the order. And the man who led the investigation in this country for the FBI, Special Agent Wayne Manis, who was brought to the Northwest and through his work and contacts with Larry Broadbent and then a full investigation led to the story that you've been hearing over the past 2 weeks. Gentlemen, welcome back to the program. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wayne, I'd like to start with you again. We have been rushing through because this story could go on for many, many programs. And near the end of last week, we put on the screen a chronology of events that you had to really move through rapidly. And at the end of the series of crimes that you identified of Order 1, you indicated that Order 2 came into being and there were bombings and then arrests. would you like to fill in a few of the details at the start of this third program?
Thank you, Tony. I will. I think it's important to note that as we reached a stage where Order 1 was winding down, we'd arrested most of the people and the trials were coming to a conclusion. Bud Cutler had attempted the assassination of Tom Martinez and had been arrested for that crime. A second group emerged from the area here in Coeur d'Alene, and that was David Dorr and Debbie Dorr, Ed Hawley and Olive Hawley, and Robert Pearies. And they initiated a second group, which they entitled as Order Number 2. And this group had the very same philosophy and intent as Order 1. That is, that they were going to finance their group through counterfeiting, through armed robberies, that they intended to commit assassinations, and they had designated as one of their assassinations the assassination of Morris Dees, who had also been designated by Order 1, but they, of course, didn't carry it out, and that they intended to do bombings. So they were structured pretty much the same as Order 1. They had stated they intended to be far more ruthless than Order 1, leaving no witnesses, and that they would attack the families and the persons of agents who interfered with their plans and their group. So this group began exactly as Order 1 had. They started counterfeiting money out at the Aryan Nation compound. We found that we saw a fellow come into their presence on August the 16th in 1986, a fellow we didn't know what his name was. We later identified him as Kenneth Lawrence Schrey. We saw him on the 16th. We observed him meet with Richard Butler on the 17th. On the 18th, we found him assassinated, blindfolded, shot through the temple on the east side of Lake Pend Oreille. We later saw this group commit multiple bombings in our community and conspiracies to commit armed robberies.
One of the targets in that bombing, too, was the president of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, Father Bill Wasmuth of the St. Pius Catholic Church.
Exactly, on September the 15th. And that was a very devastating bomb attack upon his home, upon his person. I can only say that we're fortunate this time. We weren't playing catch up. From Order 1, we had informants in place. We were watching this group develop, and once we saw these criminal acts take place, we were able to move on them rather rapidly, and we were able to bring them to justice before they had a chance to grow, as did Order 1 or commit more crimes.
And so there was, I believe, plea bargaining, and they were guilty of that particular...
We prepared for an extensive trial, and then in October of '88, the evidence was overwhelming, and they entered pleas of guilty in a plea bargaining process in Boise, yes.
Okay. Let's move on now to back up just a little bit. Now we've told the story as much as we can in the time we've had about, as you indicated, over 60 major crimes by the order. Then they came to trial, as we indicated in show number 2, in Seattle, Washington. Wayne, would you kind of take us through? I've seen the rather large document of the indictments. Just give us some statistics about how many people were involved and how many indictments there were, and a little bit about the convictions.
Well, Tony, it was a very extensive indictment, a very complex case that had been prepared by Gene Wilson, assisted by several other prominent government attorneys, and it was a 21-count indictment that basically included most all of the crimes that we've talked about in these shows. It indicted 23 members of the order, and every individual that was indicted either pled guilty or was convicted by a jury, with the exception of David Tate, who was never tried because he was convicted on the murder and the attempted murder of the two state police officers in Missouri, and had received such an extensive sentence we felt like it would be foolish to spend the time, effort, and money to try him again.
But you are satisfied from your investigation that Order 1 members, they were basically all found and they were either tried in that case in Seattle or in the case of David Tate in Missouri.
Yes, Tony. All the active members. I'm not going to say that every associate that had perhaps been affiliated in one aspect or another with a crime was necessarily brought to justice, but all the major players were apprehended and convicted.
Larry, you have followed this because, again, on show 1 we talked about how you were the first law enforcement person here that had documentation, and when Wayne Manis arrived on the scene, you shared that with him. You obviously, from another law enforcement agency, was watching an interest, and you've done so many things in law enforcement and in training other law enforcement people. You followed the trials, and could you share with us, we won't go through all 23 and
Sure.
the charges and the sentencing, but give us some examples of the kind of sentences that were handed down after they were found guilty or they pleaded guilty.
Right. Most of those that pled guilty, they received a minimum of 20 years. Those that were convicted ranged anywhere from 40 years to 100 years for their conviction. Two most prominent was Randy Dewey and Bruce Carroll Pierce, who both received 100-year sentences. There was some, Yarborough received 80 years, and so on. From a number of other convictions across the country, which are linked to the order, and most particularly the civil rights trial of Allen Berg. Those convictions, I think, netted upwards of 300 years for some of the sentencing in those areas as well. There was other indictments and convictions or guilty pleas back in Missouri and Arkansas, stemming from some of the association with order members.
So with the death of Robert Matthews and a number of the major leaders of the order who, it's my understanding what you're saying, will never get out of prison, we can say that at least at this point in history that Order 1 came to a conclusion with those convictions and imprisonment. Would you agree with that, Wayne?
Yes, that's true. Not to say that the ideology, the philosophy, or the following died with the order, but certainly the people who committed those crimes were brought to justice, each and every one.
At this point in the program, we've been using some what I call visual aids through the process. We're going to show on the screen a photograph of one of the members. One thing we haven't talked about is how they dressed or they wore uniforms, and that's part of this whole issue of paramilitary and the training that you mentioned, Wayne, on an earlier show. If you could describe the symbolism and the uniforms. I know we have that on the screen now.
Well, that's a photo of Randy Dewey in the uniform that was common in 1983 and 1984 at the Aryan Nations Organization in Hayden Lake, or Hayden, Idaho, with their the emblem that you see on the collar and the shoulder, which is the emblem of the Aryan Nation. Aryan Nation being the political arm of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian.
So it's that kind of example, along with some other evidence that you found. And Larry, I know that we've seen some photographs you have of some maneuvering and training that it is very proper to describe that there was paramilitary action taking place during this time also.
Well, certainly, it was very evident in particularly their firearms training, because it wasn't just simple target practice. There were what we describe as maybe a Hogan Alley type training, which was...
Would you explain what you mean by that for non-law enforcement people?
Right. The Hogan Alley would be sets of moving targets or movable targets. Supposedly some were good guys, bad guys, depending on their point of view. And it was to get down the reaction time of a shoot, no-shoot situations, and also perfecting their aiming and so on.
If I can get a visual picture of this, would there be like a building or a window, and
Right.
this the fake individual would go by, and as it go by, you had to make a determination whether to shoot or not shoot.
Shoot or not shoot, right. So they had them strung on pulleys, levers that popped up into a window or a doorway, that type of shooting. So it was rather sophisticated in that sense. The targets and the area was not as elaborate as possible, but the point was to get down to reaction time and also the perfection of aiming and so on.
Wayne, I believe you have an example of that too over in Montana where there was, I believe, a state trooper was a target and you were able to find that and even trace some of those bullets from the gun that finally then killed Alan Berg.
That's right, Tony. It was when we traced Bruce Carroll Pierce to one of his hideouts over in Troy, Montana. We found a plywood board with a painting of a state trooper on it. It had been shot many times, and of course we did the routine thing, and we took the casings and the bullets from that we could find that had passed through that, and ultimately it was interesting to note that those same casings and bullets matched the firearm that was the weapon that we determined was used to kill Alan Berg. Also, at the time that we had the Order Number 1 on the run, they abandoned their training camp up near Priest Lake. And, you know, they patterned their activities after a book that Larry had mentioned earlier called the Turner Diaries. Fortunately, we can read too. We read the Turner Diaries. And in the Turner Diaries, it mentioned in there that when you leave your training camp to protect your weapons, you bury them in oil inside a can, you submerge them in oil in a can, you put that can deep into the ground and cover it, and the weapons will be good when you come back to get them. So we went out with a metal detector once they abandoned that, and we were able to find their catch of weapons, very, very sophisticated catch of automatic weapons. They had the state-of-the-art for weaponry.
You've been very specific and very clear in some of the things that were going on. I want to shift gears in the time that we have left in our program, and I want to give you this scenario. Larry becomes undersheriff of Kootenai County. He confines all of his time and the sheriff all the time to other kinds of law enforcement duties. They don't look into this issue. You don't come to North Idaho. You stay in Alabama, and more time passes before there's any law enforcement review of what became known as the order. If there had been more time passed, more time to accumulate resources and personnel, Wayne, I'd like to start with you and have you to tell our viewers what you think might have happened. I know that you had some evidence of from some of the arrests and all, of plans they had, and if you could take us through some of the things you think could have happened if you hadn't gone on the scene and made the decisions you did and got involved with the full investigation at the time you did in 1984.
Well, there were many things that we discovered that were on the planning board by this group, and it's frightening when you think about it because they were organized well enough and they were committed well enough to accomplish these goals. The assassination of Norman Lear, the plan to put 50 gallons of cyanide into the Los Angeles City water system. We
uncovered
captured
this.
We captured that cyanide at the CSA compound in
So
Arkansas.
you actually got the 50 gallons of cyanide?
Yes, that's correct. Plans to, they were within 2 weeks of initiating their plans to have Morris Dees assassinated.
Let's identify for our viewers who don't know that Morris Dees is head of the Southern Poverty Law Center and is the famous civil rights lawyer that has brought some of the famous civil cases, like the case in Portland where the young Ethiopian was killed, and he's been able to get, and in Alabama with the Klan, he's been able to win lots of money lawsuits for the victims' relatives.
That's true. That's right. He was top on. They had moved him to the top of their list. And also, it's interesting to note that they'd become rather proficient in their armed robberies, and they had converted 2 members who worked for Brinks, and it was they were within 2 weeks of robbing Brinks' headquarters in San Francisco.
And do you have any idea how much money they might have got if they'd have carried that out?
A phenomenal amount of money in the multiples of millions of dollars, enough to finance a small army.
And the arrest all came just short of that taking place.
Things were timed in such a way that, fortunate as we were able to bring our evidence together and put them on the run. We took away they had to go on the defensive, and they lost their aggressive stance at that point.
Larry, I've heard you say on more than one occasion that if these kind of investigations hadn't taken place, and I know you've also given credit to organizations that organized in North Idaho and civil rights and all. I would like you to share with our viewers, now that we've been looking at this incredible story, what you would add to what Wayne Manis has said concerning what could have happened if the investigation hadn't been successful at the time that it was.
Yeah, yes, I think due to the success of how the order was to be able to commit the crimes, buy the weapon, have the money in which to do a lot of converts, there would have probably been upwards of thousands of individuals who would have probably moved into the Northwest, would have been permanently embedded in here. There's no doubt that that if such an event had taken place, I mean, and that would have probably made a continuum of other crimes, and not only in the Northwest but throughout the United States. We know, like the White Patriots Party, White Persons Party, I think it is. They were some of those converts as well. They had members that were in or associated with the order, and they also had some of the same ideas. With the money that was given to various organizations, or alleged to be, it could have been extremely difficult for us and law enforcement to have overcome that quickly as what took place.
Wayne, there's someone I want you to talk about now that you have gone through this for years. I know there's a lot of sacrifice for you. You were away from your family a lot. You were in dangerous situations at certain moments that you have shared since this is over now. But the leader, Robert Matthews, very dedicated, took control, I understand, of the organization, that it had been somewhat factious till he took over. What kind of person was he, and why was he different in the sense that he would not surrender and was much more determined to the very death?
Well, Bob Matthews was a unique individual. He was very committed to his belief, and had he not decided to take a violent course of action to violate the laws of this country, he would have undoubtedly become, I think, the most prominent leader amongst this group of people anywhere in the United States. His career was cut short by his own making, his own doing. But a very charismatic individual, and nobody could pick up and follow in his place. Bruce Carroll Pierce tried, but dissension developed in the group, and the cell splintered, and they were unable to stay together. Bob Matthews was the man who came along at the right time in 1983 to bring together this group, and when he died, the leadership died with him.
Larry, you two have read some of the things that he has written, and you had some things in your documentation. Could you take us back a little bit where he came from, and do you have any idea how someone like him can move into this kind of movement and organization? Give us your profile of Robert Matthews.
Well, we know he came out of Arizona, I believe it was, and he had some very minor brushes with law, but primarily, I think, in the taxation or protesting taxation, those areas up there. Once he came north into Idaho, he met up with another individual by the name of Kenneth Loft in Medellin Falls, Washington, and later they talked about, the philosophy, the ideology, and so on. And in fact, they formed a short organization called the White American Bastion, and that was one of the first beginnings that I was aware of Bob Matthews. I had not met him at that particular time, and my first big awareness of him was when they had the rally in Spokane, and which he was present at that time.
And you were
and I was also there too. And through a lot of that discussion, and particularly through the news media who did the interviews there, that right then, sensed an individual who had some very strong convictions. Later then, we know that he attended Aryan Nations Congress and other meetings as well up the compound there in Hayden Lake. But I agree with Wayne. He's undoubtedly had that charisma and held a certain honest to him that brought loyalty and commitment to him and his philosophy to some degree. A lot of the members who have not yet ever spoken still remain silent to this day about the activities of the order.
What did he teach about that? In some of the writings he didn't he have some comments about remaining silent or never giving up and dying, and he held to that, but other members did not hold the same degree of commitment to that pledge that he did?
Well, I believe that was in part of that ceremony of the induction when they received their Brutus Spigin
Wayne, you might want
medallions,
to share
I believe, was
Well,
parts of that.
That's true, and that was Bob Matthews wrote that as, you could say he's probably responsible for the draftment of the Declaration of War, the principles of war, and the open letter to Congress. He also set the mode for the group, that they were to be committed to not surrender. And I think that was the main thing. When we tried to get Bob to surrender in Whidbey Island, he wasn't going to do that because he felt that he was setting the guidelines for those that would follow behind him. So he wouldn't surrender. And believe me, we tried very hard to bring Matthews to a point of surrender. But he was very committed, and he was committed to make his stand there and to die there at Whidbey Island.
You had a chance to take a really quite close look at this whole process when they were all arrested and all that long process of the trials. How about other members of the order in personality and so forth? Were they all motivated by those political ideas, or did some of them come along for other reasons, or was there any variance or degree of?
Well, you had a mixture of ideology there. Some people were part of the Christian identity movement, and some were not. Robert Matthews had been a member of, or had been affiliated with the National Alliance, Dr. William Pierce's group. He had been affiliated with the Nazi Party, and then other members like Bruce Carroll Pierce had come through the Aryan Nations compound, and they were Christian identity converts. But they all came together with the same ultimate goal. And Robert Matthews was to hold them together no matter where their origin was originally. They all had the same goal, and they all took the same commitment in theory. However, in finality, only Bob Matthews held to the commitment of non-surrender.
I would not let this program conclude without making a statement I'm going to make. If we have time, we'll come back to a couple more questions. But I've given this a lot of thought as we prepared for this 3-week series, and that I've talked to both of you at great length about how we were going to structure the program so you could tell this incredible story that took place in the 1980s in the United States with the concentration here in the Northwest. It reminds me of Morris Dees and his decision to establish a memorial at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he indicated there were memorials to individuals in this country like Dr. King, but no one had established a memorial for a lot of people who had died. And when he set this up, it's, for those who aren't familiar, it's a round black marble with water flowing over it, talking about until justice flows like water. And 40 people who died in the civil rights movement, including some children, the bombing in a church, are placed there, their names, along with very important developments in that process. And although you're not involved in the political ideas, you two gentlemen were the two key law enforcement persons, one from the county sheriff's department, one from the FBI, that had the intelligence to see what was happening. You made critical decisions, and you moved forward when others did not know to, and started this investigation. Without you two gentlemen, I have no question in my mind that this would have gone much further, and although it was already a lot of serious crime, there would be victims they are not today. So I'd like to suggest, from a historical perspective, when the roll is called of the Dr. Kings and others and the children in Alabama, you two gentlemen from law enforcement will be on the roll to protect democracy and a threat that was directed at this country that you have proven and documented with the crimes. And I wanted to end this program by suggesting that you two are heroes and that your names will be there with others who have fought in war or in civil rights or whatever it was to promote and expand the democracy in this country. And I congratulate you because I know it was at a sacrifice that you did what you did. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you found the last 3 weeks a very, very serious and important topic, and I thank you for being with us during this series, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week when we will discuss what we believe, again, is an important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.